Okay, let's continue from where we left off on chapter 6. Southern Africa. In Southern Africa as well, as we shall see now, whatever native religions were, they were interpreted by Europeans according to the similarities with ancient Hebrews' rituals and became the object of the most contradictory European fantasies. A theory of degradation from an earlier higher religion, the South African version of the Hamitic hypothesis frequently appeared in reports about Southern African religions. A more diffuse and unpredictable cultural consequence of this was a theoretical dissemination of Judaism in an area where it had been totally absent. Upon his arrival in the Cape Colony in 1819, Reverend John Phillip, who was in charge of the London Missionary Society, established a kind of theory of progress, identifying the natives' potential to evolve from the ignorance he saw to a revealed religion brought by the missionaries. In contrast, other missionaries suggested that the superstitions observed among these groups were the expression of a lost religion. Using morphological and temporal comparisons, the means of language and cultural analysis, these missionaries drew imaginary paths of the degeneration of a religion down to its ruin, maintaining that the African tribes they met came from the ancient Near East. Peter Kolb, a German living in the Cape Colony in 1705, claimed he had discovered the historical roots of the religion of the Hottentots, whom he considered the children of Abraham. They allegedly had preserved, in a distorted manner, religious traditions dating back to ancient Israel. Kolb reported that the Hottentots kept an oral tradition dating back to their remote ancestors Noch and Hingnoch, who strongly evoked the biblical story of Noah. Insofar as they did not preserve a memory of Abraham, Kolb argued that it was more probable that the Hottentots descended from the troglodytes, the children of Abraham by his wife Keturah, in Genesis 25, 1-4, who not only observed all or most of the customs in which the Hottentots agree with the Jews, but likewise many other observed by the Hottentots to this day. On the comparative basis, it appeared to him likely that the troglodytes were the ancestors of the Hottentots of the Cape of Good Hope, and that their religion derived from a variety of Judaism. As Chidester pointed out, this comparison also required a redefinition of Judaism as a religious tradition that resembles the practices of Hottentots. A striking element of Kolb's analysis consisted in establishing a link in comparing the resistance of Jews and Hottentots to Christianity, and to deduce that Hottentots were stiff as Jews. Kolb's fantasies, however, had proliferated in all subsequent writings, and the French Francois Le Vaillant complained, "I have never read any voyage to Africa in which the absurd dreams of Colben have not been more or less introduced." Excuse me. Drop my phone here. Introduced. Okay, where were we here? All right. Excuse me for that. Well, after the period of the first colonizations, this construction still endured. It was still current in 1914 when Sidney Mendelssohn, a mining magnate wrote an essay entitled Judaic or Semitic Legends and Customs Among South African Natives, which was published in the Journal of the Royal African Society. 2 centuries after Cole, Mendelssohn put forward a multitude of details about the formal analogies and common descent of the Jews and the native peoples of Southern Africa. Looking at the workers in the gold and diamond mines, he wrote, In the great sea of black faces, I have seen men of such an unmistakably Jewish cast of features that I have most felt inclined to greet them as strangers in a strange land. The theory of the degeneration of an older and nobler religion was a recurring theme in the studies of Xhosa, of the Xhosa speaking peoples. Xhosa were usually referred to by the word kafir, which means unbelievers, as the expression of a religious judgment based on an ancient Chaldean root integrated in Jewish and Muslim discourses. The kafirs were considered to be a people who had once a much greater degree of civilization than they now possess. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Glasgow Missionary Society asked its correspondents in South Africa to carry out research for the purpose of comparing their traditions and customs to those of the Jews. The only answer to this request was an essay on the antiquity of circumcision, proposed by William R. Thompson. Later on, Reverend Francis Fleming identified the Xhosa as wandering Arabs of the desert, dating their origin to Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, based on the tombs with Arabic inscriptions from the Quran that had been found in the area. In the 1830s, the English colonist Thomas Phillips, who had a certain sympathy for the Xhosa, observed, they have Mahometan and Jewish rites mixed with idolatrous practices. Along the same lines, Robert Godlinton, a spokesman of the colonists, in his book, A Narrative of the Kafir Horde's Eruption, 1835, insisted that the Xhosa language exhibited traces of its Eastern origin and the frequent occurrence of words which are plainly of Arabic or Hebrew extraction. The customs of the Zulu, like those of the Hottentots and the Xhosa, were compared to those of the Jews. In the beginning of the 19th century, Shaka, the chief of a small Nguni Zulu-speaking clan, founded the Zulu Empire by violently subjugating surrounding tribes. In 1843, with the British annexation of Natal, European commenters identified the Zulu, albeit with hesitation, with Arab Semites, as was the case for the Xhosa, and more categorically with Jews. It must be said that in the 1820s, Allen Gardner, a Royal Navy sailor, in conducting a survey among a group of Zulu prisoners, had discovered the knowledge, lost over time, of the existence of a supreme being or chief, Inkosi Pezulu. Following that, G.R. Peppercorn, who was a magistrate, underlined the moral qualities of the Zulu of Natal, and the European experts of the Native Affairs Commission repeatedly reinforced the comparison with the Jews. A general type of customs with the Amazulu may be found in the early history of Hebrews, until they became a nation under a settled monarchy. Zulu life was therefore organized according to an ancient Israelite scheme that Peppercorn described as pre-monarchic, and a most perfect contradiction with the importance attached to the king and his role among the Zulu. Indeed, Europeans who wanted to know the Zulu religion could refer directly to the Bible. There they would find Zulu polygamy in the stories of patriarchs, the wedding customs in the book of Ruth, and the relationship with the work in Genesis in the story of Laban, Laban, and Jacob. The comparison between Jews and Zulus was reinforced by data provided by Henry F. Finn in the 1820s. Finn supplied an inventory of the most striking likenesses, war offerings, sin offerings, propitiatory offerings, festival of first fruits, the proportion of the sacrifice giving to the Isanusi, witch doctors, periods of uncleanness, on the decrease of relatives and touching the dead, circumcision, rules regarding chastity, rejection of swine's flesh, because of the nature of semblance of many of their customs to those of ancient Jews, as prescribed under the Levitical priesthood. Finn concluded, I am led to form the opinion that Zulu tribes have been very superior to what they are at the present time. In 1853, John W. Colenso, the Bishop of Natal, who spoke Zulu, undertook a study of their religion through long conversations with people of Natal and Zululand. His findings led him to the discovery of the belief in a supreme God, the Almighty and Prime Essence, which allowed him to ascribe a natural religion to Zulu. Colenso asserted that their religion was in reality close to revelation because the two words they used for God reflected the very ideas contained in the Hebrew words Elohim and Jehovah. As ancient Israel had two names for the same God, insisted Colenso, the same was true of the Zulu, and in the interpretation of Colenso, Inukuluku Unkulunkulu, the Almighty, was Zulu Yahweh, the creator of the world, whereas Velinkanki was Zulu Elohim, the essence of existence. Although the foundations of the comparison between Zulu and ancient Israelites had already been suggested by former observers, Colenso went further by asserting that the similarity of their ways of life provided a basis for comparison that was rich in teachings about ancient Israel. Zulu mode of life and habits, and even the nature of their country, so nearly correspond to those of ancient Israelites that the very same scenes are brought continually, as it were, before the eyes and vividly realized in a practical point of view. While doing this, Colenso developed a new way to read the Bible. In terms of the scheme and rhythms of African life, rewriting the Bible not only in the Bantu language, but from the perspective of a comparative study of religions that included Zulu religion among the religions of the world. Colenso's interpretations had a real influence, since they were resumed and developed by William R. Smith in his Lectures of the Religion of the Semites, 1889, and largely adopted by the Zulus themselves. By the beginning of the 20th century, the comparison between Zulu and Jews had been fully internalized by the Zulu in their own religious legacy. In 1901, during theological discussions between the magistrate and linguist James S. Calloway and a learned Zulu, Lazarus Mashaba, they referred explicitly to the precedents of Israel and ancient Greece to rebuild an ancient history of the Zulu religion. Mashaba cited certain customs. Both ancient Jews and Zulus slit their earlobes, burned frankincense during ceremonies, burned the bones, and cut the meat of sacrificed animals in a similar way, as evidence of a previous historical contact between the two groups. Mashaba and his friends were convinced that their lineage dated back to the lost tribes of Israel. It's a little blurry here, trying to get some clarity on this camera. Dated back to the lost tribes of Israel. 5 years later, in 1905, 5 years later, in 1905, another of Stuart's interlocutors, Dinya, reasserted this affirmation of their Jewish descent. We are anxious to find out where we come from. These Jewish customs of ours are evidence that we come from the north. For this evidence was in existence before we came in contact with Europeans. From Western to Southern Africa, missionaries, while supplying the Old Testament and identifying the African groups they encountered with the ancient Hebrews, brought to them new ideas about the history of their origins. The deployment of the myth of lost tribes and myths about Jews penetrated every corner of the African continent, serving both religious and political interest. How did the African themselves react? Interpretations of the Hebrew Bible provided the substance for many of the innovations that led to the evolution of African sacred world. Although they underwent a process of representation of Europeans, Africans were certainly not merely passive. Nowadays, none of the Southern African groups concerned accept a Jewish origin, but some of the Western and Central Africa groups I have described currently claim a Jewish descent and declare themselves to be Jews. As Jean and John Komaroff pointed out about Southern Africa, colonization during the 19th century can be seen as an intercultural exchange in which Africans and Europeans' objectives were negotiated and renegotiated. A new consciousness emerged among Africans who discussed, argued, and reconfigured their identities in new religious languages that modified their understanding of themselves. With its changing aspects, the myth of a Hamitic race, forged by Egyptologists, linguists, and theologians, persisted. It generated a silent adherence to a system of biblical values, the assimilation of which can be seen in the traditions of groups in which this book is concerned. Either degenerated compared with its origin or perpetuated from some time immemorial, the African religion as defined by colonists was in search of analogies and ancestors. Deep mental structures were mobilized within African societies, with on the one hand the nostalgia of one's origins, and on the other the resonance of the Aryan myth generating the concept of white with black skin. During the process of defining the nature of African religions by identifying and reinventing world religions in Africa, theorists of religions made the knowledge about these religions accessible and available to Africans themselves. This fanciful genealogy of religions was used in such a way that it both transferred the Middle East to Africa and dispersed in a conceptual way the native populations of Africa to the Middle East. In a more general way, the question of origin and precedence appears as the epicenter of the problematic of identity and religion of the Africans as expressed by Europeans. At the time of decolonization, Africa through the voice of its intellectuals, undertook to reclaim the center of any discourse pronounced about it. Pronounced about it. It was therefore by tracing an overly defined path about their origins that Africans began to appropriate their history. A slow, difficult, and unavoidable takeover of African history by Africans themselves ensued, influenced by African American thinkers and Afrocentrists, as defined by Molefe Asante. And I have his book, The History of Africa, which is a very good book. Molefe Asante, Afrocentrism literally places African ideas in the center of any analysis involving the culture and the behavior of Africans. And that will conclude our reading on chapter 6 of the Black Jews of Africa, encountering and reinventing the Africans and the Jews in the colonial era, 15th to 19th centuries. Stay tuned for the next reading. Give thanks for tuning in. Salam.